The wagon wheel was the color of the grave. Sunk to its axle in a slurry of mud and heat-blasted earth, it held My Lin's entire world hostage. The light blue of her prairie dress, once the color of a hopeful sky, was now spattered with the same dark, greedy soil. She was 40 years old, a widow for 6 months, and had believed herself to be past the point of needing anyone. Yet here she was, miles from the nearest town of Redemption Creek, Nevada, with every possession she owned cemented to the earth by a freak summer storm that had passed 2 nights before. She had tried a fence rail as a lever, the weathered wood groaning under the strain. Her shoulders ached, and sweat traced clean paths through the dust on her face, but the wheel did not budge. The sun was a hammer, beating down on the canvas wagon cover, baking the mud into a stubborn clay. She was a strong woman, her hands calloused from years of work her late husband, Wei, had sworn would one day end. But she was not strong enough for this. This was a task for a team of oxen, not a lone woman whose grief was still a fresh, raw thing in her chest. She rested her hands on her hips, taking a deep, shuddering breath of the hot, dry air. Panic was a luxury she could not afford. Wei had taught her that. Assess the problem, he would say. Do not let the problem assess you. The problem was simple, physics. The solution was more force than she possessed. That was when she heard it, a sound so out of place in the vast, oppressive silence that it seemed to come from a dream, the soft clink of a bridle and the rhythmic plod of a horse. She straightened up, her hand instinctively going to the small, worn handle of the knife tucked into her belt. A rider was approaching from the west, a dark shape shimmering in the heat haze. As he drew closer, the shape resolved into a man on a black horse, moving with an easy, unhurried gait. He was not a threat, not yet, but in this empty land, any stranger was a question that might have a fatal answer. He reined his horse to a halt a respectful 20 feet away, the animal shifting its weight with a soft snort. The man was tall in the saddle, his face weathered by sun and wind, shaded by the brim of a stained felt hat. He didn't speak immediately, his gaze taking in the wagon, the sunken wheel, and finally, her. His eyes were a pale, steady gray, and they held no judgment, only observation. "Looks like you found some trouble," he said. His voice was low and carried a rough, gravelly edge, like stones rolling in a slow river. My Lin's hand stayed on her knife. She had learned that a woman alone was seen either as a victim or a temptation. She intended to be neither. "The trouble found me," she replied, her own voice tighter than she would have liked. The man nodded slowly, his eyes going back to the wheel. "That it does." Sometimes he swung a leg over his saddle and dismounted in a single fluid motion. He was leaner than he'd looked on horseback, all whipcord and bone, but he moved with a deliberate economy that suggested a deep well of strength. "You try to dig it out." "I have a spade," she said, gesturing to the wagon bed. "The mud is like stone now." He walked to the edge of the mud pit, squatting down to examine the wheel. He didn't touch it, just looked, his head tilted. He was so still he could have been part of the landscape. After a long moment, he stood up and brushed the dust from his trousers. "Spade won't do it. You need leverage and a good horse. I've got one of those." He glanced at her 2 mules, who stood miserably in their harnesses, heads bowed against the flies. "Yours look about done in." It was a plain statement of fact, not an insult. She knew he was right. She also knew the danger of accepting help from a strange man in the middle of nowhere. But Wei's voice echoed in her memory again. "Use the tool that is offered." The cowboy waited, his hands loose at his sides. He made no move to come closer, leaving the decision entirely to her. That, more than anything, eased the tight knot of fear in her stomach. A man meaning harm would have pressed his advantage, used her desperation against her. This man simply stood, offering a solution as if it were a cup of water. She finally let her hand fall from her knife. "I would be grateful," she said, the words feeling heavy and strange in her mouth. She had not had to ask for help in a very long time. He gave another short nod. "Name Silas Blackwood." "My Lin," she answered. "All right, My Lin," he said, and the way he spoke her name, without hesitation or mockery, was another small surprise. He turned to his horse. Let's get your world moving again." Silas worked with a quiet competence that was almost mesmerizing. He unhitched her exhausted mules, leading them to a patch of sparse grass where they could rest. Then he brought his own horse, a powerful black gelding, to the front of the wagon. He didn't use brute force. Instead, he unpacked a length of thick rope and a block and tackle from his saddle roll, his movements precise and unhurried. He explained each step in his low, calm voice. "We'll run the rope from my saddle horn, through the tackle on the wagon tongue, and back to the horn. Doubles the pulling power," he said. "But first, we have to break the suction." He took her spade and began to dig, not at the wheel itself, but around it, creating a trench for the mud to shift into. My Lin watched for a moment, then picked up the fence rail she had used earlier and began to work on the other side of the wheel, breaking up the hardened crust of the clay. They worked in tandem, a silent, efficient team under the oppressive sun. He didn't offer platitudes or unnecessary conversation, and she was grateful for the silence. It was filled with the rhythmic scrape of the shovel and the thud of the rail, a language of shared effort that required no words. Finally, Silas straightened up, wiping his brow with the back of a gloved hand. "That should do it." He positioned his horse, tightening the rope until it was taut as a fiddle string. "Get ready to push on that spoke when I give the word," he instructed. "Just need to rock it loose." My Lin braced herself, her hands gripping the muddy wheel. She felt the immense tension in the air, the coiled power of the horse, the straining of the rope. "Now," Silas said, his voice cutting through the silence. He clucked to his horse, and the animal leaned into the harness, muscles bunching in its powerful haunches. The rope went rigid, groaning with the strain. The wagon shuddered, a deep, resonant groan echoing from the wood. My Lin threw all her weight against the spoke, her feet sliding in the slick mud. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. The wagon felt as permanent as a mountain. Then, with a sound like a giant tearing a root from the earth, the wheel broke free. The wagon lurched forward a few feet, settling on firmer ground with a heavy sigh. Silas immediately slackened the rope, patting his horse's neck. My Lin stumbled back, catching her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked at the deep rut, the hole where her life had been stuck, and then at the man who had pulled her out of it. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice filled with a genuine relief that surprised her. "Silas," he corrected gently. He was already inspecting the wheel. His expression hardened slightly. "We're not done with trouble yet. You've got 2 cracked spokes and a bent rim. It'll get you to town, but not much further. Redemption Creek is the closest place for a smith." Her relief evaporated, replaced by a familiar weariness. One problem solved, another arrived. "How far?" "Half a day, if we go slow," he said. He looked at the sky, then back at her. Roads not always safe for a woman traveling alone. It wasn't a question or a suggestion. It was another plain statement of fact. "I'll see you to town." They arrived in Redemption Creek as the afternoon sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the dusty street in shades of orange and gold. The town was little more than a single clapboard road lined with a general store, a saloon, a smithy, and a few other tired-looking buildings. As they moved down the main street, Silas riding his horse alongside her wagon, doors opened and faces appeared in windows. Conversations fell silent. My Lin felt their eyes on her, 100 tiny needles of curiosity and suspicion. A Chinese woman, alone, being escorted by a white cowboy. It was a picture that didn't fit their world. A large man in a clean, dark suit stepped out of the building marked with a sign that read Abernathy Land and title. He was broad and well-fed, with a neatly trimmed beard and a smile that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. He tipped his hat as they approached, the gesture one of practiced, condescending charm. "Well now, what have we here?" he said, his voice booming with false heartiness. He directed his gaze at Silas, completely ignoring My Lin. "Bringing some new business to town, friend." "Just helping a traveler," Silas said, his voice flat and non-committal. His hand rested on his thigh, inches from the worn leather of his holster. Abernathy's smile widened, but it was a predator's grin. He finally deigned to look at My Lin, his eye sweeping over her stained dress and the dusty wagon. "Of course. I remember your husband, Mrs. Li. Wei. A hard worker on the railroad, he was. A shame about the accident. He said her name wrong, a deliberate little jab to put her in her place. My name is My Lin, she said, her voice clear and steady. And my husband's name was on the deed." Abernathy's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Indeed. A fine piece of land he claimed. A bit much for a lone woman to handle, I'd imagine. All that clearing and building. If you find yourself in need of some capital, to perhaps start a more suitable life back in California, I would be happy to take that troublesome property off your hands. A fair price, of course. A kindness. He was speaking to her, but his eyes kept flicking to Silas, as if seeking his approval, assuming he was the one making the decisions. It was a dismissal so profound it was like a physical blow. Before Silas could speak, My Lin leaned forward on the wagon seat. "The trouble is mine to manage, Mr. Abernathy," she said, her voice ringing with a quiet authority that turned heads along the street. "The land is not for sale." Abernathy's polite facade cracked. A flicker of something cold and hard moved in his eyes. He looked from her to Silas, his mind clearly reassessing the situation. He had expected a timid, helpless widow. He had not expected this. He gave a short, sharp laugh. "As you wish." He tipped his hat again, a gesture now loaded with menace. "Welcome to Redemption Creek." The blacksmith, a gaunt man with soot-stained hands and frightened eyes, confirmed Silas's diagnosis of the wheel. "Cracked spokes, bent rim," he mumbled, refusing to meet My Lin's gaze. "Gonna take some time. Have to order the parts from Carson City. 3 days, maybe 4-inch. Silas's jaw tightened. He knew, and My Lin knew, that it was a lie. A man with a forge and hammer could fix a wooden wheel in half a day. The smith was in Abernathy's pocket, and they were being stalled. She was now a prisoner in this town that felt more like a trap than a refuge. Silas helped her secure a room at the town's only boarding house, a clean but threadbare establishment run by a stern-faced woman who looked at My Lin as if she were a strange insect. As My Lin carried her small satchel inside, she saw Silas talking quietly with the stable hand. She couldn't hear his words, but his posture was tense, alert. Later, as she watched the street from her second-story window, she saw Silas leaning against the livery wall, seemingly at ease. But his gaze was constantly moving, cataloguing every person who walked by, every shadow that deepened as the sun set. He was watching over her. He wasn't the only one watching. 2 rough-looking men loafed on the porch of the saloon across the street, their attention fixed on the boarding house. They were Abernathy's men. She had seen them flanking him earlier. As Silas pushed off the wall and walked toward the general store, the 2 men exchanged a look. One of them spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "He wants the deed, not the woman," the man said, his voice a low growl that carried in the evening air. "Make sure she understands that." From her window, My Lin saw Silas stop dead in his tracks just outside the store's pool of lantern light. He had heard them. He stood motionless for a long moment, a silhouette against the coming night, and she knew then that the broken wheel was the least of her troubles. This was not a random misfortune. It was a calculated attack. That evening, the air cooled, carrying the scent of dust and distant sagebrush. My Lin found a small, neglected garden behind the boarding house, a patch of earth with a few hardy rose bushes and a rickety wooden bench. She sat there, trying to untangle the knot of fear and anger in her gut. She was trapped, her every move watched. Abernathy was not a man who would take no for an answer. Footsteps crunched on the gravel path behind her. It was Silas. He moved without a sound, but she had felt his presence before she saw him. He didn't sit, but stood near the garden gate, his frame blocking the last of the fading light. "You should not be out here alone," he said. "Is anywhere in this town truly alone?" she countered, her voice bitter. "No," he admitted. "I heard what Abernathy's men said." My Lin looked down at her hands, clasped tightly in her lap. "I am not surprised. He is a man who mistakes politeness for weakness. He's a man who takes what he wants, Silas corrected grimly. And he wants your land. Why? There's 100 other claims to be had in this territory. She hesitated for only a moment. This man had pulled her from the mud, stood by her side, and was now standing guard in the dark. He had earned more than suspicion. She reached into the bodice of her dress and pulled out a small packet wrapped in oilskin and tied with twine. She carefully unwrapped it on the bench beside her. Inside was a folded deed, the paper crisp and official, and a letter, its paper softened and creased from many readings. "Because my land has this," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "A year-round spring. Way found it when he was surveying for the railroad. It's the only reliable water for 10 miles in any direction. In this country, water is more valuable than gold." She handed him the letter. It was written in Wei's careful, deliberate script, a mix of English words and Chinese characters. He wrote this the week before he died. He knew Abernathy wanted the spring. He told me to hold on to it, that it was our foundation. A place where we could not be pushed around anymore. Silas took the letter, holding it gently, as if it were a fragile, living thing. He didn't read it, just looked at the paper, his expression unreadable in the twilight. He understood. This wasn't just about property. It was about a promise. A legacy. He folded the letter carefully and handed it back. "My father was a farmer back in Missouri," he said, his voice so low she had to strain to hear it. "Good land, a clear title. A man like Abernathy came along. Talked about the railroad coming through, about investments and shared profits. He got my father to sign a paper, a loan against the land. The railroad never came. The loan came due. We lost everything." A piece of paper and a smiling lie. He paused, his gaze lost in the distance. "I was too young to do anything then. I just watched them ride away." In that moment, he was no longer a stranger. He was a man who had seen this story before. His help on the road, his watchfulness in town, it wasn't random charity. It was a debt he was paying to a ghost. The next morning, the town marshal paid her a visit. He was a thin, weaselly man with a tin star pinned crookedly to his vest. He stood in the doorway of her room, twisting his hat in his hands, his eyes darting around nervously. He began, "Just a friendly visit. Mr. Abernathy is a pillar of this community, you see. He worries about its integrity." He cleared his throat. "There's a territorial ordinance. About improving a claim. Requires it to be worked by a head of household, says here," he pulled a crumpled paper from his pocket, "that a claim can be challenged if it's deemed unproductive for abandons a lone woman. Well, the court might see that as an unstable situation." It was a thinly veiled threat. They were building a legal case to steal her land. Her deed meant nothing if the law itself was Abernathy's weapon. He would use the marshal and a corrupt judge to declare her unfit and seize her claim. Her heart went cold. She could fight men with guns, perhaps, but how could she fight a smiling lie backed by a man wearing a star? That afternoon, she found Silas by the livery, checking the shod on his horse. He looked up as she approached, his grey eyes questioning. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice formal, "I have a business proposal." He stopped his work, giving her his full attention. "Mr. Abernathy intends to use the law to take my land. He believes a woman cannot be at head of household. I believe he is wrong, but the law in this town belongs to him. I cannot fight him alone." She took a breath, steeling herself. "The land is valuable. The spring is a guaranteed income. I am offering you a partnership. Your name on the paperwork, your presence on the land as my hired foreman. You would provide the legal fiction they require, and the strength I lack. In return, I will give you 40% of all profits from the farm and the sale of water." It was an audacious offer. She was entrusting half of her future to a man she had known for 2 days. She was offering him a home, an income, and a very dangerous enemy. Silas stared at her, his face a mask of stone. She saw the conflict in his eyes. The freedom of the road, the drifter's life with no ties and no troubles, was pulling at him. But the memory of his father, of the land lost to a smiling lie, was pulling harder. He looked from her face to the dusty street, toward Abernathy's office. He was choosing which past he would answer to. Finally, he met her gaze. 50%, he said, his voice firm. We're partners, or we're nothing. A small, genuine smile touched my Lynn's lips for the first time in days. Partners, then, Mr. Blackwood. For months later, the Nevada sun was kinder, its autumn light casting long shadows across the homestead. The small, sturdy cabin of pine and sod stood firm against the wind, a curl of smoke rising from its stone chimney. A large, tilled garden, now dormant for the winter, was fenced off from the corral where 2 horses stood, swishing their tails. A flock of chickens scratched in the dirt near a newly built coop. This was not a claim, it was a home. Silas was mending a stretch of fence, his hammer blows echoing in the crisp air. My Lynn was scattering grain for the chickens, her movements calm and purposeful. They had worked from sunup to sundown, turning Way's dream into a reality of wood, sweat, and soil. A heavy freight wagon rumbled away from the house, its driver giving a final wave. He had just paid my Lynn in silver coin for the right to water his entire team of mules at their spring. The word had spread quickly among the freighters and drovers. Abernathy's stranglehold on the territory's water was broken. They had a contract to supply 3 different freight lines, and the silver in their cash box was proof of their success. Abernathy had not taken it well. He had sent his 2 thugs out to the homestead a month after they'd settled in. They had intended to deliver a message of intimidation. They found Silas waiting, a shotgun resting in the crook of his arm, his expression as hard and unyielding as the surrounding landscape. There had been no fight. Silas hadn't needed to raise his voice. He had simply looked at them, and they had seen a man who would not be moved, a man who had been waiting for this kind of fight his entire life. They had turned their horses around and never came back. The town marshal, seeing that his powerful patron had lost his nerve, suddenly found other duties to attend to. As evening fell, Silas came in from the cold, stamping the dust from his boots. My Lynn was by the hearth, and she handed him a steaming mug of tea without a word. Their hands brushed, a brief, warm contact that spoke of a comfortable familiarity built over months of shared labor and quiet companionship. On the simple wooden mantelpiece, 2 documents stood propped against the stone. One was Way's letter, a constant reminder of the promise that started it all. The other was their partnership agreement, signed in Redemption Creek by a nervous clerk who couldn't look Abernathy in the eye for a week. Silas looked at the paper, its ink stark against the cream-colored page. "It's a good contract," he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. My Lynn looked from the paper to his face, seeing the weathered lines around his eyes, the steadiness in his gaze. She thought of the sunken wheel, the hostile town, the fight they had won without firing a shot. "It is a good farm," she replied. They had built more than a business, more than a home. In the vast, unforgiving silence of the frontier, they had built a place where they belonged, together. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.